The morning sun cast long shadows across the weathered boards of the porch as Samuel Hayes stood watching the horizon, his calloused hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee, steam rising into the cool desert air. The ranch stretched before him, 500 acres of stubborn land that fought him every season, yet somehow had become more home than any place he'd known. At 34, Samuel cut a solitary figure against the vastness of the Montana Territory. His face bore the marks of a man who'd spent more time under open sky than roof-sun-weathered skin stretched taut over sharp cheekbones. Eyes the color of winter sage that seemed to see through things rather than at them. He wore his isolation like others wore their Sunday clothes, comfortable in its familiar weight. The cattle lowed in the distance, their morning chorus mixing with the whisper of wind through the cottonwoods down by the creek. That creek, Willow Creek, the locals called it, had been what drew him to this particular piece of earth 7 years ago. Water meant life out here, meant the difference between prosperity and ruin. But for Samuel, it meant something more. It was the sound that filled the silence, the constant companion that asked nothing of him. He drained the last of his coffee and set the cup on the porch rail. The day's work waited fences to mend, cattle to move to fresh grazing, a dozen other tasks that kept a man's hands busy and his mind occupied. That was how he preferred it. Work was straightforward, honest. It didn't lie or leave or demand pieces of his soul he wasn't willing to give. The ranch house behind him stood modest but solid, built with his own hands from timber he'd cut and hauled himself. 2 rooms were all he needed, one for sleeping, one for living. The walls held no photographs, no mementos of a life before this one. Those he'd burned in a different time, in a different place. When he'd learned the price of letting someone too close, Samuel descended the porch steps, his boots raising small clouds of dust. His horse, a bay gelding named Dusty, waited by the corral, already saddled. The animal knew the routine as well as its master up before dawn. Out with the herd, back after sunset. It was a life measured in seasons rather than days, in the slow turning of the earth rather than the quick pulse of human want. As he rode out toward the eastern pasture, Samuel's mind drifted, as it sometimes did in these quiet morning hours. 7 years ago, he'd been a different man. John Samuel Hayes, that had been his full name then, back when he'd worked his father's farm in Missouri, back when Mary's laughter had filled his days and her presence had softened his nights. But fever had taken her and their unborn child in the span of 3 days, leaving him hollow as a lightning-struck tree. He'd sold the farm, dropped his first name like shedding old skin, and headed west. Out here, a man could lose himself in the bigness of the sky, could let the wind scour away memories until only the essential remained. He'd built this ranch with the money from the farm sale and the sweat of his grief, each fence post driven into the ground like a barrier against the past. The cattle were where he'd left them, spread across the hillside like scattered seeds. Samuel counted heads automatically, checking for signs of injury or illness. This was what he understood now, the simple mathematics of survival. Grass plus water plus time equaled beef. Beef equaled money. Money equaled another season on the land. There was no room in that equation for the complexities that had once undone him. By midday, the sun hung brutal in the cloudless sky. Samuel had moved the herd to fresh grazing near the creek, where the grass grew thicker and greener. He dismounted, letting Dusty drink while he refilled his canteen. The water ran clear and cold, fed by mountain snowmelt even in the heat of summer. He splashed some on his face, feeling the shock of it against his sun-heated skin. This was his favorite spot on the whole ranch, where an ancient cottonwood spread its branches wide over a bend in the creek. The tree had probably been here before the first white man set foot in the territory, its trunk scarred by time and weather, but still standing, still reaching toward the sky. Samuel understood that tree, its solitary endurance, its acceptance of whatever the seasons brought. He ate his lunch in its shade, cold biscuits and dried beef, washed down with creek water. Simple fare for a simple life. In town, they probably talked about him, the way people in small communities talked about anyone who kept to themselves. Let them talk. He came to town once a month for supplies, spoke only when necessary, and was gone before the dust settled. He had no need for their company, their questions, their sympathies. The afternoon brought its own rhythms, mending a section of fence where the cattle had pushed through, checking the salt licks, watching always for signs of predators. Wolves and coyotes were facts of life out here, as were the occasional bear down from the mountains. Samuel had learned to read the land like scripture, to know when something was amiss by the way the birds fell silent or the cattle bunched together. As the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, Samuel turned Dusty back toward home. This was the hardest time of day, when the coming darkness seemed to press close, when the empty house waited like an open mouth. He'd grown used to it, mostly, but sometimes the silence felt heavy as stone. Back at the ranch, he tended to Dusty, first unsaddling, brushing, feeding. The horse had been a good partner these past years, steady and uncomplaining. Samuel had bought him from a Cherokee trader who'd sworn the animal had heart enough for two. That had proven true, on the worst nights, when memories came calling like wolves at the door. Samuel would sometimes stand in the barn, hand on Dusty's warm flank, drawing comfort from the animal's quiet presence. Dinner was beans and bacon, cooked over the wood stove and eaten standing at the counter. He'd built a table and chairs his first year here, but found he preferred to eat quickly and be done with it. Sitting alone at a table reminded him too much of what wasn't there. As full dark settled over the ranch, Samuel sat on the porch with his pipe, watching the stars emerge one by one. Out here, with no town lights to dim them, they blazed with a fierce brightness that still took his breath. He'd learned their names, their patterns, their seasonal wanderings. They were companions of a sort, distant and untouchable, making no demands beyond observation. The creek sang its endless song in the darkness, and somewhere an owl called, hunting. Samuel listened to the night sounds of his land, the rustle of small creatures in the brush, the distant howl of coyotes, the wind moving through grass. This was his world now, complete unto itself, bounded by fence lines and horizons. He knocked out his pipe and stood, joints stiff from the day's labor. Tomorrow would bring more of the same work and solitude, the slow turning of seasons, the careful tending of land and livestock. It was enough. It had to be enough. Inside, he lit the kerosene lamp and prepared for bed. The empty rooms didn't echo anymore. He'd grown too used to them for that. As he lay down, Samuel allowed himself one moment of honesty. He wasn't happy. Exactly. But he was content. He'd found a way to exist without the risk of loss, to move through his days without leaving himself open to the kind of pain that had driven him here. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows slightly. Samuel closed his eyes and listened to it, to the creek, to the vast breathing of the land around him. Tomorrow he would rise before dawn, would repeat the patterns that kept him anchored to this life he'd built from solitude and determination. He didn't know, couldn't know, that change was already moving toward him like weather from the west, that his carefully maintained isolation would soon be tested by eyes that held their own shadows, by a spirit as untamed as the land itself. For now, he slept the sleep of a man who believed he'd found his final shape, who'd made his peace with loneliness and called it freedom. The ranch slept with him, the cattle bedded down, the horses quiet in the corral. Only the creek remained awake, whispering its secrets to the darkness, keeping its own counsel about what was to come. The wagon lurched over another rut, and Clara Bennett gripped the wooden seat to keep from being thrown sideways. 3 weeks on the trail from Kansas, and still the Montana landscape stretched endless before them, vast and unforgiving as an ocean of grass and stone. Her father drove in stubborn silence, his jaw set against complaints he knew wouldn't come. Not from her. At 26, Clara had learned the art of swallowing words, of keeping her thoughts locked behind teeth and determination. The bonnet shielding her face from the afternoon sun couldn't hide the strength in her features, high cheekbones that caught shadows like secrets, eyes the color of deep earth after rain, a mouth that had forgotten how to smile easily. Her hands, once soft from teaching school, now bore calluses from rope and reins, from helping her father with work that should have belonged to the son he'd never had. Should reach Willow Creek settlement by nightfall. Thomas Bennett said, his first words in hours. Find a place to homestead nearby. Start fresh. Fresh. Clara almost laughed at the word, as if crossing 1,000 miles could wash away what lay behind them, as if distance could undo the shame of a broken engagement, the whispers that had driven them from their home. She touched the letter hidden in her pocket, the one she'd never shown her father, the one that revealed exactly why James Morrison had suddenly decided he couldn't marry her after all. Some secrets were better buried than shared. The oxen plodded on, their patient strength a reminder that endurance was sometimes the only virtue that mattered. Clara had learned that lesson well these past months. When James had stood in her father's parlor, his face flushed with righteous certainty, declaring he couldn't bind himself to a woman of questionable virtue, all because she'd been seen speaking alone with a traveling photographer, helping him capture images of the schoolhouse. Clara had stood straight-backed and silent. When the town had taken his side, when even her students' parents began to look at her sideways, she'd held her head high. But her father had seen the cost, seen how she stopped taking walks, stopped visiting the mercantile, stopped playing piano at church. One morning he'd simply announced they were leaving, selling the farm, heading west where land was cheap and the past couldn't follow. She'd packed without question, understanding that this was his gift to her, a new horizon, a clean slate. Now, as the settlement finally came into view, Clara felt neither hope nor despair, only a bone-deep weariness that had little to do with the journey. Willow Creek was like every other frontier town, a handful of buildings clustered together as if for protection against the emptiness surrounding them. A general store, a saloon, what might have been a church or schoolhouse, a scattering of houses in various stages of construction or decay. "We'll stop for supplies," her father said, guiding the oxen toward the store. "Ask about land availability." Clara climbed down from the wagon, her legs stiff from hours of sitting. The few people on the street watched them with the frank curiosity of those who rarely saw strangers. She met their gazes directly, a habit that had always unsettled people back home. Here, she hoped it might simply mark her as someone not to be trifled with. Inside the store, while her father spoke with the proprietor about land and water rights, Clara wandered among the shelves, such meager offerings compared to back home. But she'd learned to adjust her expectations. Her fingers traced over bolts of fabric, sacks of flour, tools whose purposes she was still learning. Through the window, she glimpsed the landscape beyond town, rolling hills dotted with sage, and in the distance, a line of green that might mark a creek. "There's good bottomland about 5 miles south," the storekeeper was saying. "Follow the creek. Some folks have tried settling there, but the winters are hard. Takes a particular kind of stubbornness to make it." Clara's father glanced at her, and she gave the slightest nod. They had stubbornness in abundance. They made camp that night beside the creek the storekeeper had mentioned, their wagons circled by the vast Montana darkness. Clara lay awake listening to the water's voice, so different from the Kansas streams she'd known. This water sang of mountains and distance, of journeys that carved through stone. She found herself walking to its edge, drawn by something she couldn't name. The moonlight turned the water to molten silver, and Clara knelt on the bank, cupping the coldness in her hands. For the first time in months, she felt something inside her unclench. Just slightly, here, with no one to see, no reputation to maintain. She let the mask slip. A few tears fell, mixing with the creek water, carried away by the current. She didn't know how long she sat there, But when she finally returned to camp, her father was awake, tending the fire. "Can't sleep either?" he asked softly. "The water," she said. "It's different here." He nodded, understanding more than her simple words conveyed. "We'll build near it. Water's life out here." Over the following days, they established their claim 160 acres of grassland with creek frontage, far enough from town for privacy but close enough for necessary supplies. Her father threw himself into the work with an energy that belied his 58 years, as if he could build her a fortress against the world with logs and determination. Clara worked beside him, learning skills that would have horrified her former neighbors. She helped fell trees, strip bark, notch logs. Her hands bled, healed, hardened. When they raised the walls of their cabin, she felt a fierce pride that had nothing to do with the life she'd left behind. But it was the creek that drew her during the precious moments of rest. Something about its constancy, its indifference to human sorrow, offered a strange comfort. She would walk its banks in the early morning or at sunset, when the light transformed the landscape into something otherworldly. Sometimes she brought her father's rifle, though more for the weight of it than any real fear. The land felt empty but not threatening, as if it were waiting for something. One evening, as purple shadows pooled in the valleys, Clara discovered a particular bend in the creek where an enormous cottonwood presided over a natural pool. The tree's roots formed hollows and seats, as if inviting contemplation. She sat there as the sun died behind the mountains, feeling for the first time since leaving Kansas that she might be able to build something here, not just a house, but a life. Her father noticed the change in her, the way she moved with more purpose, spoke with less guardedness. "This place agrees with you," he said one night over their simple supper. "It asks nothing of me but strength." Clara replied, "I can give it that." What she didn't say was how the vastness made her feel both small and significant, how the silence was different from the suffocating quiet of social exile. Here, she could be alone without loneliness, could work until her body ached and sleep without dreams. Here, no one knew that James Morrison had called her compromised, that the photographer had offered her more than artistic instruction, that she'd refused him and still been condemned for the mere appearance of impropriety. As autumn approached, their cabin stood complete if rough, their claim marked and registered. Clara had learned to shoot, to read weather and cloud formations, to know when the cattle they'd acquired were uneasy and why. She wore men's trousers for work, her mother's dresses forgotten in a trunk. Her skin had darkened from sun, her body grown lean and strong. Sometimes, standing by the creek at day's end, she barely recognized the woman reflected in the water. Good, she thought. Let Clara Bennett, the schoolteacher, fade like morning mist. What emerged in her place had no name yet, but it felt truer than anything she'd been before. The cottonwood by the pool became her sanctuary, the place where she could drop all pretense and simply exist. She didn't know that others knew of this place too, that her solitary refuge was not as secret as she believed. For now, it was enough to sit beneath its ancient branches, to listen to the water's endless story, to feel herself becoming something new in this hard, beautiful land. Soon the weather would turn, her father warned. Winter in Montana was nothing like Kansas, the old-timers in town had said, but Clara found herself unafraid. She'd survived other winters, the kind that had nothing to do with snow. Whatever came, she would meet it with the same fierce grace she'd learned from the creek itself, flowing around obstacles, carving new channels when necessary, always moving forward. The land waited, patient and eternal, and Clara Bennett waited with it, unknowing that her carefully rebuilt solitude was about to intersect with another's, that the creek which had become her salvation would soon witness a different kind of reckoning altogether. The October morning carried the first real bite of winter, frost silvering the grass along Willow Creek as Samuel Hayes rode his northern boundary. He'd been up since before dawn, checking for breaks in the fence line where his cattle might stray onto neighboring land. The work was routine, meditative almost. his mind empty of everything but the task at hand. Dusty picked his way carefully down the steep bank toward the creek crossing. This far north. Samuel's property narrowed to a strip of prime bottomland where the creek curved through a grove of cottonwoods. He rarely came here, it was too far from the main house for practical purposes, but autumn storms had been fierce this year, and he needed to ensure no deadfall blocked the water's flow. As they approached the crossing, Dusty's ears pricked forward, and the horse slowed without being asked. Samuel's hand moved instinctively to the rifle in his saddle scabbard, though he didn't draw it. Could be deer, could be nothing, but Dusty wasn't given to spooking at shadows. Then he saw her. A woman knelt by the pool beneath the largest cottonwood, her back to him. Auburn hair caught up loosely with pins that let tendrils escape to frame her neck. She wore a man's coat over what might have been a work dress, and beside her lay a rifle laid down but within reach, the way someone familiar with frontier dangers would place it. Samuel held perfectly still, torn between retreating unseen and announcing himself. She seemed absorbed in something, her head bent forward, and he realized she was washing clothes in the cold creek water. The sight was so unexpected, so domestic in this wild place, that for a moment he simply stared. Dusty decided matters by snorting softly, and the woman's reaction was immediate. She didn't scream or startle like a town woman might have. Instead, she moved with fluid economy, her hand finding the rifle as she turned, rising to one knee in a position that would allow either flight or fight. Their eyes met across perhaps 30 feet of space, and Samuel felt something shift in his chest, like ice cracking on a frozen pond. Her face was angular, sun-touched, with eyes that held neither fear nor welcome, only assessment. She kept the rifle pointed down but ready, her finger resting alongside the trigger guard rather than on it. Someone had taught her well. For a long moment, neither spoke. The creek filled the silence with its constant murmur, and somewhere above them, a hawk cried out. Hunting. Finally, Samuel touched the brim of his hat slightly. "Ma'am?" His voice came out rougher than intended, unused to addressing anyone beyond his horse or cattle. She didn't lower the rifle. "Sir?" Her voice carried a slight Kansas flatness, but there was steel beneath it. "This is Bennett land." "No, ma'am," Samuel said carefully, keeping his hands visible on the saddle horn. "This is Hayes land. Has been for 7 years. A frown creased her brow, but she held her position. "The land office in town showed us the boundaries. Our claim runs to the creek." "To the south bank of the creek," Samuel corrected. "North bank's mine. Always has been." She studied him for another long moment, then slowly stood, letting the rifle point toward the ground, though she didn't set it down. "I see. I wasn't aware the boundary was so precise." "Water rights," Samuel said simply. "Out here, they matter." "Yes," she said, "they do." Another silence stretched between them. Samuel knew he should say something more, perhaps offer to show her the survey markers, but words seemed to have deserted him. She stood there like she belonged, despite being on his land, comfortable with the rifle's weight, meeting his gaze without coyness or flirtation. Her presence unsettled him in ways that had nothing to do with property lines. "I'll gather my things," she said finally, moving to collect the washing she'd spread on the rocks. "No need to rush," Samuel heard himself say. "Creek's low enough this time of year, no harm done." She paused, looking back at him with those dark, evaluating eyes. "That's kind of you." Kind. The word sat strangely on him. When was the last time anyone had called him kind? He shifted in the saddle, suddenly aware of how he must look unshaven, clothes worn and mended, the very picture of frontier isolation. "Samuel Hayes," he said abruptly, surprising himself with the offer of his name. "Clara Bennett," she replied after a moment's hesitation. "My father and I have the claim south of here. We arrived last month." He'd heard about new settlers south of his property, but hadn't paid much attention. Town gossip held little interest for him. Now he found himself curious despite his better judgment. From Kansas. A shadow crossed her features.
Yes.
The single word carried weight, like a door closing. Samuel recognized the tone he'd used it himself when anyone asked about Missouri. Some things weren't meant for sharing with strangers. "Well, Miss Bennett," he said, preparing to turn Dusty away.
"The creek's yours to use. South Bank or no, just—"
He paused, searching for words that wouldn't sound presumptuous.
"Be careful. Cat tracks upstream last week. Mountain lion, probably just passing through, but worth knowing.
Thank you for the warning." She'd relaxed slightly, though the rifle remained in her hands. "I'll be watchful." He nodded and began to guide Dusty back up the bank, then stopped.
"That rifle, you know how to use it."
For the first time, something that might have been amusement flickered in her eyes. "Well enough to feed my father and myself these past weeks. Well enough to discourage the curious." "Good," Samuel said, and meant it. A woman alone by the creek needed to be able to defend herself. The fact that she could ease something in him he didn't want to examine. He was halfway up the bank when her voice stopped him. "Mr. Hayes." He turned in the saddle.
"Thank you for not—"
She gestured vaguely. "Most men would have ordered me off. Forcefully." "I'm not most men," Samuel said, then immediately wished he hadn't. It sounded like boasting, like something a younger man might say to impress a woman. "I mean, property lines matter, but so does being neighborly."
"Yes,"
she said softly.
"It does."
Samuel rode away without looking back, but he felt her presence behind him like heat from a fire. His carefully ordered world, the one he'd built from solitude and routine, suddenly felt shifted, as if someone had moved his fence posts in the night. Back at his cabin, he tried to return to the day's tasks, but found himself distracted. He kept seeing her there by the creek, the way she'd moved from peace to readiness in one fluid motion, the direct way she'd met his eyes. No simpering, no false modesty, no fear. Just a woman doing what needed doing, washing clothes in cold water because frontier life demanded it. He'd thought himself beyond such foolishness, had believed the part of him that noticed women had been buried with Mary. But Clara Bennett had looked at him like she was taking his measure, and somehow he felt he'd come up short. That evening, Samuel found himself on his porch despite the chill, smoking his pipe and watching the northern sky. The creek sang its familiar song in the darkness, but now he wondered if she heard it too from her father's claim to the south. Did she sit by it in the evenings as he did? Did she find the same solace in its constancy? "Fool," he muttered to himself, knocking out his pipe with more force than necessary. One chance encounter, and here he was, thinking like a green boy. He'd chosen his life, built it carefully to avoid just such complications. Tomorrow he'd ride the eastern boundaries, stay away from the creek, let this strange disturbance settle. But as he lay in his narrow bed that night, Samuel couldn't stop remembering the way she'd said his name, Mr. Hayes, like it was something worth knowing. Couldn't stop wondering what had driven her from Kansas, what weight she carried behind those watchful eyes. The wind picked up outside, rattling the windows, and Samuel turned onto his side, willing sleep to come. He'd learned long ago that some doors were better left closed, some paths better left untaken. Clara Bennett, with her steady hands and direct gaze, was a complication he couldn't afford. Yet even as he told himself this, some part of him knew it was already too late. She'd stood by his creek, their creek, like she belonged there, and something in him had recognized something in her. Two solitary souls who'd learned to be sufficient unto themselves, meeting by chance in a place that demanded nothing less than everything a person had to give. Tomorrow he'd return to his routines, his careful isolation. But tonight, with the creek singing and the memory of auburn hair catching morning light, Samuel Hayes allowed himself to wonder what it might mean to be known again, to be measured by eyes that had seen their own share of troubles and chosen to keep standing anyway. The thought terrified him more than any mountain lion ever could. The first frost had come and gone, leaving the morning grass crisp beneath Clara's boots as she made her way to the creek. 3 days had passed since her encounter with Samuel Hayes, and she'd found herself returning to the spot despite, or perhaps because of his revelation about the property line. She told herself it was practical. The pool beneath the cottonwood was deeper, better for washing. But practical lies were still lies, and Clara had promised herself honesty, at least in her own thoughts. She'd seen him twice since then, though he hadn't seen her. Once riding the ridgeline at sunset, his silhouette dark against the flame-colored sky. Once mending fence near where their properties touched, his movements methodical and sure. Both times she'd stayed hidden, watching from the willows, telling herself she was simply being cautious about a neighbor whose temperament remained unknown. But she knew better. Something about Samuel Hayes had lodged beneath her skin like a splinter, not painful exactly, but impossible to ignore. The way he'd sat his horse with perfect stillness, the careful distance he'd maintained, the roughness in his voice when he'd warned her about the mountain lion. He'd looked at her without the calculating interest she'd grown accustomed to from men, without the quick catalog of her unmarried state, her father's land, her potential usefulness. He'd simply looked, acknowledged her presence, and moved on. It was unsettling. It was intriguing. This morning, she arrived at the creek to find boot prints in the soft earth near the water's edge. Fresh prints, the edges still sharp. Her hand went to her rifle, but intuition told her there was no danger here. The prints led to the pool, circled it once, then returned the way they'd come, as if someone had been checking something, or looking for something. Clara knelt by the water, setting her washing aside. The morning was warmer than recent days, autumn's last gift before winter's grip tightened. She'd learned to treasure such mornings, when the sun felt kind rather than punishing, when the air smelled of sage and distance. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made her tense, but she didn't reach for the rifle. Somehow, she knew who it would be before Dusty's nose appeared through the cottonwood's drooping branches. Miss Bennet. Samuel Hayes touched his hat brim, remaining mounted. Today he looked marginally less wild, his jaw freshly shaved, his shirt newer than the one he'd worn before. The change was subtle but telling. Mr. Hayes. She stood slowly, brushing dirt from her skirt. Checking your boundaries again. Something that might have been amusement flickered in his eyes. Making sure that cat moved on. Tracks were fresh yesterday. I appreciate your concern, Clara said, meaning it. Though I suspect you have enough to worry about with your own land. He shifted in the saddle, his gaze moving to the pool, the cottonwood, anywhere but directly at her. Neighbors look out for each other out here. It's expected. Is it? The question came out more pointed than she'd intended. I hadn't noticed an abundance of neighboring since we arrived. Now he did look at her, really looked, and Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the morning sun. Takes time, he said quietly. Trust is earned slow out here, lost fast. There was weight behind those words, the kind that came from experience. Clara found herself stepping closer, drawn by an impulse she didn't examine. Speaking from experience, his jaw tightened. We all are, aren't we, else we'd still be wherever we came from instead of... He gestured at the vast landscape surrounding them. Here. Here, Clara echoed. The word held multitudes escape. Possibility, exile, hope. Yes, I suppose we are. They stood in silence for a moment, the creek murmuring between them. Then Samuel dismounted, a decision seeming to pass across his features. He moved with the controlled grace of a man who spent his life working with large animals in uncertain ground. That rifle, he said, nodding toward her weapon. You mentioned hunting. What's your experience with larger game? Clara blinked at the change of subject. Deer, mostly. Some antelope. Why? Winter's coming fast. Your first Montana winter. It wasn't a question. Deer will move to lower ground soon. Harder to find. But there's elk higher up. One elk could feed you and your father for months. I've never hunted elk. Different from deer, smarter, warier. He paused, seeming to wage some internal battle. I'm riding up to the high meadows tomorrow. If you wanted, that is, if your father could spare you. Clara's heart did something unexpected in her chest. You're offering to take me hunting. Color darkened his weathered cheeks. Offering to show you where they move, how they think. What you do with the knowledge is your business. It was an offer wrapped in practicality, but Clara heard what lay beneath it. An excuse for company, perhaps, a test of her skills, maybe simply the act of a man who'd remembered what it meant to be neighborly. My father can spare me, she said. What time? Dawn, meet here. He moved back toward Dusty, then paused. Dress warm, layers, and bring food for the day we'll be riding hard. I can keep up, Clara said, a thread of challenge in her voice. He looked back at her, and for the first time, she saw what might have been a smile ghost across his features. I believe you can, Miss Bennett. After he'd gone, Clara stood by the pool for a long time, her washing forgotten. She'd come to Montana to disappear, to become invisible, to live without the weight of others' expectations and judgments. But Samuel Hayes saw her not as a spinster, not as a woman with a past, but as someone capable of hunting elk and riding hard and meeting the challenges this land threw at them all. It was terrifying. It was exhilarating. That evening, she told her father about the hunting expedition, bracing for questions or concerns. But Thomas Bennett simply nodded, his eyes thoughtful as he cleaned his pipe. Hayes has a good reputation, he said finally. Keeps to himself but pays his debts, treats his animals well. Men judge other men by such things out here. He's teaching me to hunt elk, Clara said, hearing the defensiveness in her own voice. Nothing more. Her father's weathered face creased in what might have been amusement. Did I suggest otherwise? He studied her for a moment. You've been different since we arrived here. Stronger, more yourself than you were back home. There was no room to be myself back home, Clara said quietly. No, her father agreed. There wasn't. He stood, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. Hayes lost his wife years back, from what I heard in town. Came out here like us, looking for, well, whatever it is we look for when we run from memories. Clara covered his hand with hers. I'm not looking for anything. Papa, I'm just learning to survive. Sometimes, her father said. That's how the best things find us, when we're not looking. That night, Clara lay awake planning. What to wear, what to bring, how to present herself as a capable hunter rather than a burden. But beneath the practical considerations, something else hummed anticipation. Not for romance, she told herself firmly. She'd had enough of men's promises, their fickleness, their conditions, but for companionship. Perhaps. For the chance to test herself against this land with someone who understood its demands. The moon rose late, casting silver light through her small window. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, answered by another, then another, until the night filled with their wild chorus. Clara listened and felt no fear, only a kinship with creatures that sang their solitude to the sky. Tomorrow she would ride into the mountains with a man who asked nothing of her but competence. Tomorrow she would hunt elk and pretend not to notice the way Samuel Hayes moved through the world like he was perpetually braced against a wind only he could feel. Tomorrow she would take another step toward becoming whoever Clara Bennett was meant to be in this raw, demanding place. But tonight, she allowed herself to wonder what it meant that he'd come back to check for mountain lion tracks by her washing pool. Allowed herself to consider that perhaps she wasn't the only one fighting the pull of whatever had sparked between them in that first silent moment by the creek. The coyotes sang on, and Clara finally slept, her dreams full of mountains and morning light, of careful distances maintained and the possibility of crossing them, one cautious step at a time. The gunshot cracked through the morning air like thunder, sending birds erupting from the cottonwoods. Clara spun toward the sound, her rifle already half raised, her heart hammering against her ribs. The shot had come from the direction of her father's claim. Too close, too wrong for hunting. She'd been walking to meet Samuel for their planned elk hunt, but now she broke into a run, her boots slipping on the frost-slicked grass. Another shot rang out. Then men's voices, rough, unfamiliar, carrying that edge of violence she'd learned to recognize in Kansas when the border raiders came through. Clara dropped behind a fallen log, forcing herself to breathe slowly, to think. 3 voices, maybe 4. Her father had ridden to town yesterday for supplies and wasn't due back until afternoon. The cabin should be empty, but smoke rose from the chimney someone had made themselves at home. Moving carefully, she circled wide through the willows until she could see the cabin. 3 horses stood tied outside, their saddles worn and patched. Through the window, she glimpsed movement men ransacking her home, tossing out her mother's china, the quilts she'd brought from Kansas. Rage rose in her throat like bile. These men, whoever they were destroying the fragile new life she and her father had built. But rage was dangerous. She needed to be smart. 3 men, possibly armed, and her with 1 rifle and a belt knife. A hand fell on her shoulder, and Clara nearly screamed before recognizing Samuel's touch. He'd appeared beside her, silent as smoke, his own rifle ready, his face grim beneath the shadow of his hat. "Saw the smoke from the ridge," he whispered, his breath warm against her ear. "Your father." "Town," she breathed back. He nodded, studying the scene with the calculating look of a man who'd survived his share of trouble. "Bart Mason's crew, claim jumpers out of Wyoming, thought they'd moved on after the marshal ran them out of Billings. They're in my home." The words came out harder than she intended. "And they'll leave it," Samuel said with quiet certainty. "One way or another." He touched her arm, guiding her further back into the brush. "Can you circle around to the creek side, that window?" He pointed to the cabin's rear. "Gives you a clear shot into the main room. I'll come from the front. Draw them out." "That's 3 against 1, Clara protested. His mouth curved in what wasn't quite a smile. "They won't expect trouble. Men like that never do. They think the world's theirs for the taking." His eyes met hers, winter sage green and steady. "You trust me?" The question held weight beyond tactics. Clara found herself nodding before she'd made a conscious decision. "Yes." "Then go. Wait for my signal. You'll know it." And Clara. He used her given name for the first time. Soft as a prayer. "Don't hesitate. Men like these, they don't deserve your mercy." Clara moved through the brush like her father had taught her, testing each step before committing her weight. The creek covered any small sound she made. Through the gaps in the willows, she could see the men more clearly now, dirty, rough-looking, wearing gun belts that had seen use. One had her father's whiskey bottle, drinking straight from it while going through their books. She settled into position behind a thick cottonwood trunk, sighting through the window. Her hands were steady despite the anger burning in her chest. These men had invaded her sanctuary, contaminated it with their presence. Whatever happened next, they'd brought on themselves. Samuel emerged from the brush like he'd been born from it, walking straight toward the cabin with his rifle casual in his hands. "Morning, boys," he called out, voice carrying easy authority. "Believe you might be lost." The men inside scrambled, one reaching for his gun before thinking better of it. The apparent leader, a thick-set man with a scar bisecting his left eyebrow, stepped onto the porch. "Well now." The man, presumably Bart Mason, drawled, "Samuel Hayes. Heard you'd gone soft, living out here all alone." "Not so soft I can't recognize trash when it blows onto my neighbor's property." Samuel replied. His stance looked relaxed, but Clara could see the readiness in it, like a cougar before it springs. "Your neighbor," Mason laughed, ugly and knowing. "Since when do you care about neighbors? Hayes' way, I heard it. You came out here to get away from all that." "Things change." Samuel's voice had gone quiet, dangerous. You boys have about 30 seconds to mount up and ride out. Or what? Another man had joined Mason on the porch. Younger, twitchy, his hand hovering near his pistol. You'll take on all three of us for some nester's daughter who ain't even here to appreciate it. Clara saw Samuel's shoulders tense, knew the signal when it came. His rifle swung up smooth as thought, and she fired through the window at the same instant. The twitchy man cried out, clutching his shoulder as her bullet found its mark. Samuel's shot took Mason's gun from his holster, sending it spinning into the dirt. The third man burst from the cabin, firing wild. Clara worked the lever of her rifle, sighted, fired again. This bullet creased his ribs, sending him stumbling. Samuel had moved, faster than seemed possible for a man his size, putting himself between the cabin and better cover. "The woman's behind us," the wounded man shouted, panic in his voice. Mason's eyes went wide as he realized they were caught in a crossfire. "You brought help." "A neighbor's daughter's got strong opinions about claim jumpers," Samuel said conversationally, though his rifle never wavered. "Stronger aim, too. That shoulder's going to trouble your boy for months." Clara stepped from behind the cottonwood, rifle trained on the third man who was trying to stop the bleeding from his ribs. "Drop the guns," she called. "All of them. Knives, too." They complied, suddenly eager to avoid more bloodshed. Mason's scarred face was dark with fury, but he recognized defeat. "This ain't over, Hayes. You just made an enemy." "Already had plenty of those," Samuel replied. "One more won't cost me sleep." Clara moved closer, keeping her rifle ready. Up close, she could smell whiskey and trail dirt on them, see the mean smallness in their eyes. "You destroyed my mother's china," she said quietly. "Drank my father's whiskey, made my home feel dirty." Mason sneered. "Gonna cry about it, girlie?" The rifle butt caught him across the jaw before Clara had consciously decided to move. He went down hard, spitting blood and teeth. The other two men stepped back, suddenly wary of the woman they'd dismissed. "Get on your horses," Samuel ordered. "Ride north and keep riding. I see you in this territory again. We won't have a conversation first." They scrambled to comply, Mason needing help to mount with his jaw already swelling. As they rode off, the twitchy one looked back, cradling his wounded shoulder. "You'll regret this, both of you." Samuel waited until they were specks in the distance before lowering his rifle. Then he turned to Clara, something unreadable in his expression. "You all right?" "Yes." Her voice came out steadier than she felt. Now that the danger had passed, her hands wanted to shake. "Thank you. If you hadn't come—" "You'd have handled it," he interrupted. "Maybe differently, but you'd have managed. You're not the type to roll over for men like that." Clara looked at her cabin, at the scattered belongings, the door hanging askew. They ruined it, made it feel... She couldn't finish. "They made it yours," Samuel said quietly. When she looked at him in surprise, he continued, "You fought for it, bled for it, in a way. That changes things. Makes a place belong to you in ways papers never could." She understood then. His isolation wasn't just preference, it was protection. He'd fought for his place too, carved it from the wilderness and defended it from those who'd take it. "Will they come back?" Samuel's gaze followed the dust trail north. "Maybe. Men like Mason hold grudges, but they're cowards at heart. Prefer easy targets." He looked back at her. "You're not that. Not anymore." They stood there in the morning sun, surrounded by the debris of violation, but somehow closer than they'd been. Clara felt something shift between them, a recognition that went beyond attraction or loneliness. They were alike, shaped by loss and hardened by necessity, choosing solitude not from weakness but from strength. "I should clean up," Clara said finally. "I'll help." When she started to protest, he held up a hand. "Neighbors, remember, let me at least fix that door. Your father will want to find you safe when he returns." They worked in companionable silence, Samuel repairing what the intruders had broken while Clara salvaged what she could. Her mother's china was mostly destroyed, but she found one teacup intact, miraculously whole among the shards. She cradled it carefully, this last piece of a gentler life. "Tell me about her," Samuel said quietly, noting her care with the cup. Clara found herself talking as they worked, about her mother's grace, her father's devotion, the life they'd built before fever took her. Samuel listened without interrupting, his presence solid and undemanding. When she finally fell silent, he shared his own loss, brief words about Mary, about the child who'd never drawn breath, about choosing emptiness over the risk of such pain again. By the time they finished, the sun stood high overhead. The cabin looked almost normal, though Clara knew she'd see those men's shadows in corners for weeks to come. "That elk hunt," Samuel said as he prepared to leave. "Offer stands, if you're still interested." Clara looked at him, this man who'd appeared like an avenging angel when she needed help, who'd understood without explaining about fighting for your place in the world. "Tomorrow." "Tomorrow," he agreed. Then, softer, "You did well today. Most would have frozen or run." "I'm not most people," Clara said, echoing his words from their first meeting. "No," Samuel said, that almost smile ghosting across his features again. "You're not—" After he'd gone, Clara sat on her porch with her father's rifle across her knees, watching the horizon. The encounter had changed something fundamental. She'd been tested and hadn't broken. More than that, she'd found an ally in the last place she'd expected. Tomorrow they would hunt elk, but today she'd learned she could defend what was hers, that she wasn't alone on this frontier, and that Samuel Hayes saw her as she truly was, not delicate, not requiring protection, but capable of standing beside him as an equal. The teacup sat on the table inside, last remnant of a world that seemed impossibly distant now. Clara didn't mourn it. She'd found something better here, not gentility, but strength, not safety, but respect. And perhaps, though she hardly dared name it, the beginning of something that could grow between two people who'd chosen isolation but found themselves stronger together than apart. The creek ran silver in the twilight, reflecting the last rays of sun that painted the sky in shades of rose and amber. Clara stood at the water's edge, her hands still trembling slightly from the morning's events. She'd sent her father to town with news of the claim jumpers, insisting she was fine alone. But fine was a relative term, and the shadows seemed deeper now, holding threats she hadn't imagined before. She heard him before she saw him, the soft footfall of a man who knew how to move quietly, but chose to announce himself. Samuel emerged from the cottonwoods, leading Dusty, his rifle absent for once. He looked different in the gentle light, less guarded, though his eyes still carried that watchful quality she'd come to recognize. "Thought you might be here," he said simply. Clara didn't ask how he knew. This place had become her refuge, and somehow he'd understood that. "Couldn't stay in the cabin. It still feels—" "Wrong," he finished. "I know." He tied Dusty to a low branch and moved to stand beside her, careful to maintain distance between them. The creek murmured its endless story, and for a moment they simply stood, watching the water carry away the day's light. "You saved my home today," Clara said finally. "Maybe my life." "You saved yourself," Samuel corrected. "I just evened the odds." She turned to face him then, studying his profile in the fading light. "Why you've kept to yourself for years. From what people say, why risk that for neighbors you barely know?" He was quiet so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of old decisions. "Maybe I'm tired of keeping to myself. Maybe seeing you that first day, holding that rifle like you knew how to use it, not backing down." He paused, jaw working. "Maybe it reminded me there's different kinds of strength than the kind that builds walls." "I've built my share of walls," Clara said softly. "I know." He looked at her then, really looked, and Clara felt exposed in a way that had nothing to do with physical vulnerability. Takes one to know one, I suppose. The admission hung between them, fragile as spun glass. Clara found herself stepping closer, drawn by something stronger than caution. "What happened today, those men, won't be the last trouble you see out here," Samuel said. "This land doesn't coddle anyone, especially women alone." "I'm not alone," Clara said, the words coming out fiercer than intended. "My father—" "Your father's a good man, but he's aging. You're the strength of that claim, and you know it." His hand moved, as if to touch her, then dropped. "Just like I know you could handle whatever comes, but that doesn't mean you have to handle it alone." The words carried an offer, carefully veiled but present. Clara's heart beat faster, recognizing the precipice they stood on. All day she'd been telling herself that her feelings were just gratitude, that the way her pulse quickened when he appeared was merely the aftermath of danger. But standing here in the gathering darkness, she couldn't maintain the lie. "Samuel," she began, then stopped, uncertain how to navigate this unfamiliar territory. In Kansas, courtship had been formal, structured, safe. This felt like stepping off a cliff into open air. He turned to face her fully, and the movement brought them closer. She could smell leather and wood smoke on him, see the way his throat worked as he swallowed. "I told myself I was done with this," he said roughly, "with wanting things I couldn't keep. But you—" He broke off, frustrated with his own inability to articulate. "I know," Clara whispered, because she did know. She'd made the same promises to herself, built the same walls, chosen the same isolation. "I came here to disappear, to never have to explain myself or justify my choices or live down to someone else's expectations. And now? Now I find myself looking for you on the ridgeline, listening for your horse, wondering what you're thinking when you stare at the horizon like you're seeing something the rest of us can't." His hand came up then, slowly, giving her time to step back. When she didn't, his fingers brushed her cheek, calloused and gentle. "Clara," just her name, but weighted with everything they weren't saying. She turned her face into his palm, closing her eyes. "You belong to no man," she said, echoing words she'd spoken to herself 100 times since leaving Kansas. "That's what I told myself, what I promised, that I'd never again let someone have that kind of power over me." "I don't want power over you," Samuel said, his voice rough. "I want—" He struggled again, then gave up on words entirely. The kiss was inevitable as gravity, as natural as the creek's flow toward the sea. His lips were warm and certain against hers, and Clara felt something inside her crack open like ice in spring. Her hands found his shoulders, solid and real, anchoring her as the world tilted. When they broke apart, she was breathing hard, her careful control shattered. Samuel's eyes were dark, pupils wide in the twilight, and his hand still cupped her cheek like she was something precious. Clara began, then stopped, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what had just shifted between them. "I know," he said again, and this time the words held different meaning. "I know you're scared. I know this changes everything. I know we can't go back." She stepped back, needing distance to think, but her body felt magnetized to his. "This doesn't mean I'm not—" "You belong to no man." Samuel repeated her words back to her, and somehow on his lips they sounded different. Not like ownership, but like recognition. "I'm not asking you to belong to me, Clara. I'm asking if maybe—" He paused, searching for words that his isolated years hadn't prepared him for. "If maybe we could belong to the same things. This land, this life, each other. Not as property, but as choice." Clara felt tears prick her eyes, though she couldn't have said why. Perhaps because he understood. In a way James never had. In a way she'd never expected anyone to understand. That she needed to be herself first, complete and whole, before she could share that self with another. "I need time," she managed, "to think, to understand what this means." "Time I have plenty of," Samuel said, stepping back to give her the space she needed. Been waiting 7 years already. A little more won't kill me. Despite everything, Clara found herself almost smiling. Patient man. Out here teaches patience or kills you. I learned. They stood awkwardly for a moment, the kiss still hanging between them like morning mist. Then Samuel moved to untie Dusty, preparing to leave. But before mounting, he turned back. That elk hunt, still planning on tomorrow? Clara nodded, not trusting her voice. Good. Dawn, then, and Clara. He swung into the saddle with economical grace. What happened just now, it doesn't change what I said before. You've got nothing to prove to me. Come tomorrow because you want to learn to hunt elk, not because of this. He gestured between them, encompassing everything they'd said and not said, done and not done. Clara appreciated his attempt to give her back her autonomy, to make clear that the kiss created no obligations. I'll be there, she said simply. He touched his hat brim and rode off, disappearing into the gathering darkness. Clara stood by the creek until full night had fallen, until the first stars appeared in the vast Montana sky. Her lips still tingled from his kiss. Her cheek still felt warm where he'd touched her. She'd come to this territory to escape the power others had over her, to never again be diminished by someone else's expectations or conditions. But what Samuel offered felt different, not a cage, but a partnership. Not ownership, but mutual choice. You belong to no man, she whispered to the darkness, testing the words. They still felt true, still felt like armor against a world that would make her small. But perhaps belonging with someone was different than belonging to them. Perhaps two people could choose each other and remain whole. The creek sang its ancient song, indifferent to human complications. Clara listened to it and made her own promises to the night. She would go hunting tomorrow. She would learn what she needed to learn, and she would decide, in her own time and on her own terms, what to do about Samuel Hayes and the way he made her feel like she could be both strong and soft, both independent and connected. For now, that was enough. The kiss lingered in her memory like sweetness on the tongue. Promise and possibility and terrifying hope all rolled into one perfect moment by the water. She touched her fingers to her lips, still feeling the warmth of him, then turned and walked back to her cabin. Tomorrow would bring what it brought. Tonight, she would hold this new knowledge close and secret, examining it like a prospector studies gold, determining its true worth. The stars wheeled overhead, ancient and patient, and Clara Bennett walked home alone, but not lonely, carrying the echo of her name spoken like a prayer and the memory of calloused fingers gentle against her skin. The general store in Willow Creek had never been so quiet. Clara felt the weight of eyes upon her as she moved through the narrow aisles, gathering supplies with deliberate calm. Whispers followed in her wake like dust devils, words caught and carried on the breath of scandal. And saw them riding together at dawn, fighting off claim jumpers like some wild woman. Her father permits such behavior. No wonder she couldn't keep a man in Kansas. Mrs. Adelaide Hutchins, the store owner's wife and the town's self-appointed moral guardian, stood near the fabric bolts with two other women, their heads bent together like crows over carrion. When Clara approached the counter with her goods, Adelaide's thin lips pursed with disapproval. "Miss Bennett," she said, her voice carrying the false sweetness of poisoned honey. "How? Interesting to see you in town. We heard about your recent troubles with those ruffians." "News travels fast," Clara replied evenly, setting her purchases on the counter. "Indeed it does." Adelaide's eyes glittered with malicious curiosity. "Especially news about unmarried women entertaining male visitors at all hours, fighting alongside them, no less such unusual behavior for a lady." Clara's hand stilled on the coffee tin she'd selected. Behind the counter, Mr. Hutchins busied himself with his ledger, clearly wanting no part of his wife's interrogation. "I defended my home," Clara said, her voice steady despite the heat rising in her cheeks. With the help of a neighbor. I fail to see anything unusual in that. A neighbor. Adelaide savored the word like something bitter. Yes, we've all heard about Samuel Hayes and his neighborly assistants, riding out alone with him, spending entire days unchaperoned. One wonders what your poor father thinks. My father thinks I'm capable of conducting myself appropriately, Clara said, meeting Adelaide's gaze directly. As I've done my entire life. Have you? The other woman, Mrs. Donnelly, leaned forward eagerly. Because we heard tell from Kansas way that there was some unpleasantness, something about a broken engagement. The words hit Clara like a physical blow, but she kept her expression neutral. Of course the story had followed her here. Gossip was currency on the frontier, traded as readily as goods. My past is my own business, Clara said quietly, as is my present. Not when it affects the moral character of our community, Adelaide declared, drawing herself up righteously. We have standards here in Willow Creek, Christian standards, and unmarried women gallivanting about with hermit ranchers, shooting at men like some kind of savage. It's simply not done. Clara felt her temper rising, hot and dangerous. These women with their comfortable lives, their secure positions, their petty judgments, what did they know of survival, of choosing between propriety and starvation? What would you have had me do? She asked, her voice deceptively soft. Allow those men to ransack my home, wait meekly for them to finish. Perhaps offer them tea. Adelaide flushed. A proper woman would have sought help from the marshal, from the men of the town. The marshal was 30 miles away. Clara interrupted. And the men of this town were notably absent when trouble came calling. Samuel Hayes was the only one who answered. Because you've encouraged his attentions, Mrs. Donnelly burst out. Everyone's seen how you walk along the creek, how you meet him there. It's unseemly. It's what? Clara's control finally snapped. It's two people who've lost everything finding a moment's peace by running water. It's neighbors helping each other survive another season. Or is it simply that I refuse to simper and bow and pretend weakness I don't feel? The store had gone completely silent. Even Mr. Hutchins had stopped pretending to work, watching the confrontation with worried eyes. Adelaide's face had turned an unbecoming shade of red. You forget yourself, Miss Bennett. Your behavior reflects on all of us. What will people think of Willow Creek if we allow such improprieties? I think, a new voice said from the doorway, they'll think we're hypocrites who've forgotten what frontier life actually demands. Clara turned to see Samuel standing in the entrance, his presence filling the space like a storm front. He removed his hat, but made no other concession to politeness, his eyes cold as they surveyed the gathered women. Mr. Hayes, Adelaide stuttered, clearly unprepared for his appearance. We were just... I heard what you were doing, Samuel said flatly. Gossiping about a woman who's shown more courage in a month than most show in a lifetime. Condemning her for surviving, for refusing to be victimized. Now see here, Mrs. Donnelly began, but Samuel's look silenced her. No, you see here, he said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man who'd faced down worse than social disapproval. Clara Bennett saved her father's homestead. She stood her ground against armed men. She's worked that land with her own hands, asked for nothing but fair treatment, and conducted herself with more honor than those who'd judge her. He moved to stand beside Clara, not touching but close enough that his intent was clear. If you have issue with her actions, you have issue with mine. And unlike Miss Bennett, I don't much care what you think of my reputation. Adelaide's mouth opened and closed like a landed fish. The other women exchanged uncertain glances, clearly reconsidering their attack in the face of Samuel's defense. Clara found her voice. I don't need you to... I know you don't, Samuel interrupted gently, glancing at her. But that doesn't mean you should have to stand alone. The words echoed their conversation by the creek, and Clara felt something ease in her chest. This wasn't about possession or protection. It was about choosing to face the world's judgment together rather than apart. Mr. Hutchins cleared his throat. Will that be all for your purchases, Miss Bennett?
Yes,
Clara said, grateful for the escape he offered.
thank you.
As Hutchins tallied her goods, Adelaide made one last attempt. This isn't over, Miss Bennett. The church council will hear of this. Your father, my father, Thomas Bennett said from the doorway, his voice carrying paternal steel, is right here, and he's heard quite enough. Clara hadn't seen her father enter, but there he stood, travel-dusty and grim-faced. He looked older than his years, but no less formidable for it. A man who'd buried a wife and uprooted his life for his daughter's sake. Thomas, Adelaide began, her tone shifting to appeal to masculine authority. Surely you can see how your daughter's behavior— My daughter's behavior, Thomas interrupted, has been exemplary. She's kept us fed, kept our home safe, and shown the kind of backbone this territory demands. If that offends your delicate sensibilities, perhaps you're living in the wrong place. He moved to Clara's side, flanking her opposite Samuel. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. The woman who'd been cornered now stood supported, protected not because she was weak, but because she was valued. Furthermore, Thomas continued, his eyes hard, if I hear any more whispers about Kansas, about matters that are none of your concern and less of your business, I'll be having words with your husbands about the loose tongues of their wives. Are we clear? The threat was politely delivered, but unmistakable. The women retreated, muttering among themselves, but no longer bold in their condemnation. They swept from the store in a rustle of righteous indignation, leaving silence in their wake. Clara sagged slightly, the confrontation having taken more from her than she'd expected. Her father's hand touched her elbow, steady and reassuring. Thank you, she said quietly, including both men in her gratitude. No thanks needed, Thomas said, though I am curious about this riding out at dawn business. Color flooded Clara's cheeks.
Papa?
Elk hunting, Samuel supplied, his tone matter-of-fact. Your daughter's become a fair shot. Figured she should learn to take larger game before winter sets in proper. Thomas studied Samuel for a long moment, taking in the way the younger man stood protective but not possessive, close but not presumptuous. Whatever he saw seemed to satisfy him. Elk hunting, he repeated. Well, can't argue with preparing for winter. He paused, then added meaningfully, though I trust all hunting expeditions are conducted with proper regard for safety, in all respects. Yes, sir, Samuel said, meeting his eyes steadily. In all respects. Clara wanted to sink through the floor, but her father merely nodded and began helping gather her purchases as they prepared to leave. Samuel touched his hat brim. Miss Bennett, Mr. Bennett, good day to you both. He left without another word, but Clara felt the promise in his departure he'd stood with her publicly, faced down the gossips, made clear where his loyalties lay. The consequences of that would ripple through the small community like stones in water. On the ride home, her father was quiet for a long while. Finally, he said, "He's a good man. Clara, damaged, maybe, but good."
Papa!
I'm not pushing, Thomas said gently, just observing. And what I observe is that you're different around him. More yourself, somehow. Like you were before Kansas, before Morrison, before you learned to make yourself smaller to fit others' expectations. Clara gripped the wagon seat, emotions churning. They'll never stop talking. You know that. It'll be like Kansas all over again. No, her father said firmly. It won't, because here you're not alone. Here you have people willing to stand with you, to face down the whispers. And Clara, he glanced at her with eyes that held both love and pride. Here you're not trying to be someone you're not. That makes all the difference. As their homestead came into view, Clara thought about his words. She'd fled Kansas to escape judgment, only to find it waiting here too. But this time, she'd met it head-on, supported by unexpected allies. The gossips would talk, they always did, but she'd learned something valuable today. She belonged to no man. That remained true. But perhaps she belonged with some people, her father, who'd sacrificed comfort for her freedom, and Samuel, who'd walked into a store full of wagging tongues to stand beside her. Not because she needed defending, but because she deserved support. The sun was setting as they reached home, painting the sky in shades of defiance. Tomorrow there would be more whispers, more looks, more judgment. But tonight, Clara Bennett knew she could face them all. She was not alone, and that, perhaps, was the greatest strength of all. Spring came late to Montana that year, but when it arrived, it transformed the landscape with violent beauty. The creek ran high with snowmelt, and wildflowers carpeted the meadows in purple and gold. Clara stood in the doorway of the cabin, watching her father work the vegetable garden they'd carved from the stubborn earth. His movements were slower than last year, but his spirit remained undaunted. 8 months had passed since the confrontation in the general store. The gossips had eventually tired of their speculation, especially after Samuel Hayes had made it clear that anyone who troubled the Bennetts would answer to him, not through words or threats, but through quiet actions helping with the heavy work, ensuring their wood pile never ran low, being visibly present when strangers passed through. But he'd been careful too, mindful of her reputation in ways that touched Clara's heart. Their meetings were in daylight, often with her father present. When they rode out to check cattle or hunt, they returned before dark. He courted her with the patient intensity of a man who'd learned to value what was precious, who understood that trust, once broken, mended slowly if at all. "Riders coming," her father called, shading his eyes against the morning sun. Clara reached for the rifle by the door, then relaxed as she recognized Dusty's familiar gait. But Samuel wasn't alone. Marshal Jim Crawford rode beside him, his silver badge catching the light. "Miss Bennett, Thomas." The marshal touched his hat. "Sorry to disturb your morning, but we've got news you need to hear." Clara's stomach tightened. "Those claim jumpers." "Bart Mason's dead," Crawford said bluntly. "Shot trying to rob a bank in Cheyenne, but his cousins are gathering men, talking revenge. Word is they blame Hayes here for starting their run of bad luck." Samuel's face remained impassive, but Clara saw the tension in his shoulders. "How many?" "Maybe a dozen, maybe more." Crawford shifted in his saddle. "I'm riding to Fort Benton, trying to get some soldiers stationed here temporary-like. But that'll take time we might not have." "We'll be ready," Thomas said quietly. After the marshal left, they stood in waited silence. Clara knew what this meant, violence coming to their doorstep again, but worse this time, organized, vengeful. "You should leave," Samuel said finally, not looking at her. "You and your father both. Visit relatives back east until this blows over." "No." The word came out harder than Clara intended. Samuel turned to her, and she saw fear in his eyes, not for himself, but for her. "Clara, these aren't just drifters looking for easy pickings. They're coming for blood, my blood, specifically. But they won't care who gets caught in the crossfire." "Then we'd better make sure we're not caught." Clara said, "We're not running. This is our home." "Clara's right," Thomas added. "We've put too much into this place to abandon it now. Besides," he looked at Samuel with steady eyes, "neighbors stand together. You taught us that." Something passed across Samuel's face, surprise, gratitude, and something deeper. "This isn't your fight. It became our fight the moment you stood with us," Clara said softly. "Did you think we'd forget that we'd let you face this alone?" They spent the next days preparing. Samuel moved his cattle closer to his ranch house. While the Bennetts did the same, they stockpiled ammunition, reinforced windows, planned lines of sight and retreat. Other neighbors, shamefaced about their earlier distance, began offering help. The attempted store humiliation had backfired Clara's courage, and Samuel's loyalty had earned respect that gossip couldn't erode. On the 4th night, as they kept watch from Samuel's porch, Clara found herself alone with him for the first time in weeks. Her father dozed in a chair, rifle across his knees, while crickets sang in the darkness. "I need to tell you something," Samuel said quietly. "In case..." "Don't..." Clara placed her hand over his. "No last words. No final confessions. We're going to survive this." He turned his palm up, interlacing their fingers. "Still, you should know these months, since you came here. I'd forgotten what it felt like to hope for things, to want a future instead of just enduring the present." Clara's throat tightened. "Samuel, I love you." The words came out rough, unpracticed. "Not the way I loved before. Young and careless. This is different. Deliberate. A choice I make every morning when I wake up. Every night when I wonder what you're doing. If you're safe. If you might someday feel..." "I already do," Clara whispered. "You impossible, stubborn, wonderful man. I already do." He pulled her close then, and she rested her head against his shoulder, feeling the steady beat of his heart. Tomorrow might bring violence, might test everything they'd built, but tonight they had the acknowledgement of what had grown between them, patient and strong as prairie grass. They came at dawn, as Samuel had predicted they would. Clara saw the dust cloud first, called out the warning. Her father took position at the north window while she covered the east. Samuel stood ready at the door, calm as stone. "Hayes," a voice bellowed from beyond rifle range. "Come out and face justice for our cousin." "Justice or murder," Samuel called back. "I know the difference, even if you don't." The first shots shattered the morning stillness. Clara fired carefully, picking her targets, trying to disable rather than kill. These men had been led here by grief and lies she wouldn't add to the bloodshed unnecessarily. The battle raged for what felt like hours, but was probably minutes. Samuel's planning proved sound, their defensive positions held, their ammunition sufficient, but the attackers were persistent, driven by whiskey courage and misplaced loyalty. Then Clara heard what she'd been dreading, the thunder of hooves from the south. More riders, but whose? She squinted through the gun smoke and felt her heart leap. Neighbors the Hendersons, the Kowalskis, even prim Mrs. Donnelly's husband riding hard with rifles raised. The tide turned quickly after that, caught between defending fire and unexpected reinforcements. Mason's cousins broke and ran. Several lay wounded, groaning in the dust. The rest scattered like quail, heading for the horizon and, hopefully, better sense. In the aftermath, as they tended wounds and counted costs, Clara found herself surrounded by people who'd once whispered behind their hands about her propriety. Now they clasped her shoulder, praised her steady aim, thanked her for standing firm. "Seems we misjudged you, Miss Bennett." "Mrs." Donnelly's husband said gruffly. "Takes real sand to hold a line like that." But Clara barely heard him. Her eyes were on Samuel, who stood apart, watching the horizon where the attackers had disappeared. She went to him, not caring who saw, and took his hand. "It's over," she said. "For now." He looked down at her, and his stern features softened. "You could have been killed." "So could you, so could any of us." She squeezed his fingers. "But we weren't. We stood together, and we won." 3 weeks later, on a Sunday morning with the creek running clear and wildflowers nodding in the breeze, Clara Bennett married Samuel Hayes beneath the cottonwood tree where they'd first met. Her father gave her away with tears in his eyes and joy in his smile. The whole community attended, even Adelaide Hutchins, subdued and respectful now. Clara wore her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit her work-strengthened frame. Samuel stood waiting in his best shirt, looking at her like she was water in the desert, sustenance and salvation both. "You belong to no man," he whispered as she reached him, quiet enough that only she could hear. "No," she agreed, smiling through her own tears. "But I choose to belong with you." The circuit preacher spoke words about love and commitment, about two becoming one, But Clara heard deeper truths in the creek's constant murmur about endurance and adaptation, about finding strength in another without losing yourself, about building something new from the ashes of old pain. When Samuel kissed her, it was with the same intensity as that first time by the water, but tempered now with certainty. They'd been tested by violence and gossip, by doubt and distance. They'd chosen each other not in the heat of passion, but in the clarity of danger. Not despite their scars, but because of how those scars had shaped them. The celebration lasted until sunset, the whole community gathering to feast and dance and pretend they'd always supported this match. Clara danced with her father, seeing his contentment, his relief that she'd found a partner worthy of her strength. She danced with neighbors who'd become friends, with women who'd learned to respect what they'd once condemned. But mostly, she stood with Samuel on the creek bank as twilight painted the sky purple, watching the water that had brought them together flow endlessly toward tomorrow. "No regrets?" he asked, his arm around her waist. "None," Clara said firmly. "We'll build something good here. Samuel, something lasting." "We already have," he said, pressing a kiss to her temple. "The rest is just living it." As stars began to emerge in the vast Montana sky, Clara thought about the journey that had brought her here. She'd fled Kansas broken and bitter, convinced she'd never trust again. Instead, she'd found herself. Found strength she didn't know she possessed. Found a love built on mutual respect rather than pretty promises. The creek sang on. Witness to all their moments' first meeting, first kiss, first declaration, and now this new beginning. Clara listened to its voice and heard not an ending but a continuation, not a destination but an endless journey shared between two souls who'd learned that belonging together was the greatest freedom of all. In the morning, they would begin the work of combining two ranches, two lives, two solitary hearts into something stronger than either alone. There would be challenges, weather and predators, markets and droughts, the 1,000 natural shocks that frontier flesh was heir to. But tonight, standing by the water that had been their constant companion, Clara and Samuel faced the future without fear. They'd chosen each other with eyes wide open, knowing the costs, accepting the risks, embracing the possibilities. And in that choice, freely made and fiercely defended, they'd found their way home. Thank you for listening to this Wild West love story. I'd love to know where you're enjoying this tale, whether you're listening during your commute, relaxing at home, or perhaps even somewhere out in nature like our characters. Please subscribe to From Wild West channel and share your thoughts about Clara and Samuel's journey in the comments below. Your feedback means the world to us, and we love connecting with fellow admirers of frontier romance.